Churchill once said, when asked to give a talk, "How long can I speak?" And they said, "We want you to do it in 15 minutes. He said, "In that case, you'll have to pay. Give me an hour and you won't. You have to pay tonight because I've only got 15 minutes. Obviously, time is not the greatest category that we're concerned about tonight. The title that I was given was Hope for an Anxious World. This is going to turn very much upside down. The hope comes right at the end. The anxiety is what we have to deal with now. And we're not actually engaging with it in the Christian church as we need to. The greatest teacher of all time never wrote a word on paper for us to peruse. But we don't have only secondary sources. We have first-hand accounts by his disciples, most of whom died as martyrs. They taught us that Jesus commands us to go and tell what he has done for us. In the modern West, but not in Africa, we don't do that very much at all. We are silent. This aspect of our world was predicted many years ago by Yeats when he wrote the most read poem of the 20th century, which opens with the line, "Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold," and ends, "The best lack all conviction, and the worst are full of passionate intensity." That's our world, isn't it? In a couple of lines of poetry, he predicted 2024. You can fill in the gaps for yourself, but this is the world of the university today. Are you going to send your children there? That's the question. In the past, we thought of this course as being preparatory for some, not for all. But we're much less certain what this course is about now because of the nature of the world that we have to deal with. I mean, just think that the first black president of Harvard was also the shortest tenure of a president of Harvard because she wasn't appointed for the job. She was appointed because of her identity, which was also fake. And if you haven't watched her make a total debacle of her position in front of Congress, it's worth watching on YouTube because it is increasing. Anti-Semitism was rife on the Harvard campus, and she did nothing about it. When she was called before Congress, she tried to make excuse. The people who'd appointed her hadn't even done due diligence. She had a total of 9 publications, half of which were plagiarized. She was I don't know what word to use, fill in your own blank. She even plagiarized the acknowledgements. She couldn't be bothered to write down her own acknowledgements. She took somebody else's. That is an insult to the black community. There are very many very good black scholars who could have made black people proud of what they would have done at Harvard. Instead, they did the opposite. I hope it wasn't for malice. It was because they were sucked into a way of understanding the world which is utterly incapable of making the world run well. As it happens in my case, 3 of the best students I've ever had are black. One is heading his way towards being the head of Cape Town Medical School, which is where I expect him to end up. Another ended up with a Wellcome Fellowship for Life in the University of Jamaica, in the University of West Indies in Jamaica. And the third, the one I know best actually, ran the best HIV program in the English-speaking world and was then attacked by the homosexuals. But he didn't yield an inch. Intelligence is distributed randomly. And in fact, there is, in Africa at least, some burden that they have to carry, because my special interest of malnutrition, protein doesn't matter at all for acute malnutrition, but a chronically low protein intake, and by that I mean less than 4% of calories from protein, does lead to statural failure of height. And that correlates with losing, on average, 5 to 10 points on the IQ. So until we've had normal nutrition for at least 2 generations, we can't even talk about that, because the effect lasts a couple of generations in experimental animals anyway. No, the world is populated by plenty of very, very smart black people. My favourite YouTube character is Tom Sowell, without any question. Always worth listening to. I don't know what he believes because he doesn't tell you, but my goodness, he's got a mind like a razor blade. It's so sad, and most people don't even know who he is. Most black people don't know who he is. That's the world we're in. What are we going to do about it? Several other disasters have occurred, and you can find them for yourself. You'll be filling in the blanks for the disasters that come when you practice identity politics. The only reason for being appointed as an academic, as an engineer, as a doctor, anything of importance is competence. And anything that undermines competence as the first criteria is not defensible. What you do is increase the competence in the group that's underprivileged, so-called. People have grown. Tom Sowell grew up in New York, in a poor part of New York, but as he said, he's 90 now. He's written 3 books since he was 80. He says they would sleep on the fire escape in summer when it was hot, and he never heard a gunshot when he was growing up. He went back to his high school not long ago and was looking out the window at a park, and he said to the students in the room, "I used to walk my dog in that park." And they all looked up in horror. We wouldn't go near it. It's not a safe place to go anymore. The world has fallen apart. And the extent to which we are responsible is great. When Jesus said, "You are the salt of the earth. If the salt loses its taste, it's good for nothing except to be cast out and trodden underfoot of men," he's talking about us. And what was the function of salt? To preserve what is good and destroy what is evil. That's what Christians are supposed to do. Now, preserving what is good in this world will get you into trouble. Destroying what is evil will get you into trouble. So if you're not getting into trouble, it's because you're hiding. And it's time to come out and take the flak. Now, you can be smart about it. They are dumb, so we don't have to lose. So I want to talk, first of all, a little bit about education as I understand it, and a little bit about the anxiety that is plaguing our world. That will come more at the end than at the beginning. I hope that every one of you in this room has had the experience of knowing that the Lord is with you through his Spirit, using you to advance the Spirit's work in the world, of convincing the world of sin, righteousness, and judgment. That verse from John 16 has been very important to me over the years, because I have spent, really since 1990, thank you very much, doing most years several hundred lectures on Christian apologetics in liberal environments. That's fun. If you want a real adrenaline rush, I don't think there's a better one than deconstructing a woman's desire for abortion in Harvard. That'll give you an adrenaline rush, but it also will give you the experience that because it's God's activity, you have nothing to fear. And in the middle of that particular lecture, Augustine College actually popped up, because I give the talk called The Domino Effect of Roe v. Wade. We all know that in theory, although there's no practical evidence, that if abortion was banned, there would be an increase in maternal mortality rate. In fact, the experiment of nature has been done in Chile, and it didn't happen. But nevertheless, anyone who has seen a woman die of a septic abortion never wants to see another. So, in a secular world that does not believe there's anything beyond ourselves, abortion is going to be done. It ought to be done in a clean environment. I don't see any way we could deny that. There are plenty of people who would do it, but it ought to be hard to get. But no backstreet abortions. They made up the numbers, of course, because they're not compatible with what happened in renal dialysis units at the time. So I was giving the course of and taking them through the consequences of saying, I believe a woman has a right to abortion. It's a consequential statement. And, of course, they said there'd be no slippery slope. There is, etc., etc. And I was about halfway through this lecture, and so far it was all right. And you have debates with yourself as you're going along. And one of the things that I hold comes from the abortion movement is the animal rights movement. When you do one thing wrong, you sort of overplay your hand in another area, and that's what's happened with animal rights. And I was thinking, shall I say that? I'm in enough trouble already. But then Graham Hunter, one of the founders of this college, came into my head. Graham is remarkable for the amount of poetry he has. Press a button and you get the whole of Alfred J. Prufrock without looking at a book. He has vast amounts of poetry that he can recite at will. But it was just 10 lines or so, because from a poem called The White-tailed Hornet. It's written by Tom Frost, Harvard's favourite son. And I thought, this is too good to miss, so I went ahead. In this poem, he lived on a farm, as I do, and hornets are part of the deal, and they're interesting insects, and he used to watch them every year, but they're territorial. They'll sting you without you doing anything except going too close. And that had happened to him this year. That's the first bit of the poem. And then he went back, nevertheless, knowing the limit, and he said he was watching a hornet attack the remains of a nail in the barn wall and took 3 goes to find out that it wasn't food. And then he realized he'd been guilty of anthropomorphizing an insect. It was just a bundle of instincts. It wasn't thinking. It doesn't have a brain to think with. It was just following its reflexes, and the nail was confused with reality of another sort. And then he wrote this: won't this instinct matter bear revision? Won't almost any theory bear revision? To err is human, not to animal. A compliment that really takes away instead of gives. Our humour, conscientiousness and worship went long since to the dogs under the table and served us right for having instituted downward comparisons. As long on earth as our comparisons were stoutly upwards, with gods and angels we were men at least. But once our comparisons were yielded downwards into the mud and even dust, 'twas disillusion upon disillusion. We were lost piecemeal to the animals, like people thrown out to delay the wolves. Only our fallibility was left us, and this day's work makes even that seem doubtful. The impact that had on a Harvard audience was a joy to watch. They did not expect their favourite son to be used against them. It was a lovely lecture for me, not for them, I suspect. But I hadn't used that poem for years. But it came into my mind at the exact moment when I need it. That only happens, of course, when you've got into the position of exposing yourself on behalf of what you say you believe, being willing to take the risk. Sometimes the martyrs didn't know what they were doing. The guy who stopped the gladiatorial contests died in the process. So he was not to see that he had had a major impact on history, but he did. But we are largely silent. I try to be open to using the obvious evangelistic moment for me, which is travel. Every time you sit down in a plane, the person next to you is going to say, in most cases, good morning or good afternoon, where are you going, home or away, what do you do? That sequence is pretty routine. When it comes to what I do, I say, well, I'm a retired physician, but I talk about ethics, culture, faith, and public policy. And that's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it? And I say, yes, how do you do that? And I say, well, I often start with happiness. Everybody wants to be happy, don't they? And of course, everybody says yes. I say, well, are you interested? I could probably make your ideas of happiness a bit deeper than they were before. But I warn you, it's dangerous. This could change your life. So if you say stop, I will. No one ever has. It's called The 4 Levels of Happiness. You can find it on my website. It's the best pre-evangelism tool I know. I modified it from Robert Spitzer, and the two of us got a book dedicated to us as a result, which was rather nice, another lovely story. But Jesus does actually command you, go and tell what the Lord has done for you. Now, if you're a Christian, you've had experiences which you acknowledged were God at work in your life. Why haven't you shared them? When we do, the church grows. In Africa, they share their experience of God coming into their life. They don't have a Christian culture yet, but they're heading in the right direction, and we're headed in the wrong direction. We are allowing ourselves to be shaped by the culture. It's going to take time to shape the Christian culture in Africa. From the arrival of the gospel, which is accepted, to the emergence of Judeo-Christian structure, is usually measured in centuries. It's just about beginning in West Africa, where they've got 200 years, but it's got a long way to go. It's not going to be quick. In the case of Britain, when we were reconverted, so to speak, the time of Gregory, it was another, how many N hundred years? I think it's 300 years to Alfred, who was the first and greatest king we had, who actually taught his people the scripture and actually translated some into the vernacular. That's how long it takes. So we shouldn't be in a hurry. You can see that the first step is there, because when I go to Africa and the Africans discovered that I really love teaching scripture, they wouldn't let me see patients anymore. They said, Médecins Sans Frontières can do that, but we don't have a teacher like you. And they thought 3 to 6 hours was about right, with a break in the middle. That'll be the day. Well, actually, it's happened. When it happens in the Western world, we'll know there's hope, because we need revival. On one occasion, Whitfield was speaking, I think it was in Cambridge, but somewhere like that. He'd been going for about an hour and a half, and he said, I must stop. And somebody in the congregation said, for God's sake, sir, continue. I would like to hear that happen to me. It would be wonderful. But courtesy of Sally's quickness on the ball, we did have a 5-hour question period in the University of St. Petersburg. That's pretty amazing. Of course, the worse it gets, the longer the question period. So if I go to the Bible Belt, 20 minutes is the maximum. I've had 3 hours in New York. So the world is getting worse without any Christian. So our hope is that we might be galvanized into activity, not in our comfort zone, but outside our comfort zone. The way it's getting worse is astonishing. Everywhere I go, family practitioners tell me that they're having to cope with a maelstrom of anxiety. I hadn't really become aware of how bad it was until really the last couple of months, when Jonathan Haidt, H-A-I-D-T, I heard him speaking on YouTube, and then he said he'd got a book coming out on the anxious generation, which I've read in the last week. It is an astonishing book. He was wanting it to be part of a much bigger book, but he started with anxiety. And when what he discovered made it clear to him that he had to write a book on that alone, and quickly, because it's so bad. And what he stumbled upon is a better understanding of something which I'm sure you've all seen. That utter nonsense of families going out for a meal together, and the young ones are looking at their phone for the whole of the meal. I know that the iPhone is a disaster, but I hadn't worked out why. He has. It first came on the market in 2013 or thereabouts. And the data on anxiety, which is they've been collecting their data for years regularly, and it was a straight line. It's gone up continuously since the arrival of the iPhone. If you were over 25 when it arrived, you handled it all right. Under 25, you're paying a price for what it's doing to you. And conservative Christians are doing better as a group than many others. But 25% of university students admit to having serious problems with anxiety. Now, I'd seen it, and I just was too dumb to recognize it. When I was teaching medical school, we had to have one prof who was really like a Catholic priest. A student could go to him or her and say, I need help. And the reason? Anxiety. They get into medical school, in many cases, by working far too hard. You should, if you really want a career, you need to get into the lower levels of it without much effort. Otherwise, you're making a cross to carry for life. And so very quickly, students find the amount of material that's being dumped on them, which is ridiculous anyway, and they can't handle it. And they go to the prof who is not going to put it on the record and say, I can't handle an exam every 6 weeks where we have to memorize vast amounts of material. And I'm using drugs, alcohol, mindless sex. I need help. And they get it. And it doesn't go on their record. But of course, they're not going to be as good as they should have been. But nobody asked, what's the stimulus behind this, and do we do anything about it? Part of it, of course, is the way we teach. Many parents look at how many notes the child has made, or what things they can regurgitate at the time. They don't ask the important question, how have you been changed? We had some hint of that in the students' comments. But education is meant to change us. Now, in most cases, I think I've had one student come up to me after 25 years of teaching biochemistry, able to remember something I taught them in that area, maybe two, because they forget it. The way we teach biochemistry to medical students is so stupid, only an educationalist could do it. They simply look what's in the textbook, turn it into a curriculum, and then turn it into something to memorize. And I had to teach that, and I was very cynical, and I said, look, you're not going to remember any of this. It's a short-term memory test. Treat it that way, totally cynically. You may remember the Krebs cycle. It's of absolutely no value to you. You will never see a patient without a Krebs cycle. No Krebs cycle, you're dead. The bits of biochemistry that actually matter in medicine are very obscure. Usually takes me 6 weeks to solve them. I can tell it's a metabolic disorder, but working out what it is, often it requires bits of liver being sent halfway around the world. But some things stick with you for life. That's real learning. And you should note those down when they happen. This week, and these things is what should happen to every Christian. We got an email from New Zealand. It's a doctor who's now a consultant in emergency care. And it began, I heard you in Queenstown in 2007. Your way of presenting the Christian faith to medical students was very helpful to me. I'm now established, but I need education. Here's the group who really want to be educated. But because of the levels of anxiety, in the last few trips to the States, I haven't had any students come up and say, I want to come and do the Augustine course. Because they're too anxious. They won't go more than spitting distance from home, so to speak. They don't have your kind of courage to go, which in the past we taught children. I mean, I started traveling at the age of 12. We're not doing that anymore. So I hope you will all go away and think about and pray about. I challenge you to do this. If you can't think of any way in which you've had an impact on a non-Christian in the last little while, ask God to give you a passage of Scripture from Him to you to put into your soul by memorization to begin with, and then to use it. And He will do it. It may take some months before it happens, but He will do it. The gospel was gossiped. It had no organization in its most explosive growth period. None. But it grew because everybody else looked and said, behold how these Christians love one another. The other interesting question with its students today is, I asked them, have you ever left a class and said, I'm wiser than I was before the beginning of this class? The answer, of course, is no, and the word wisdom doesn't occur in the modern university. They can't handle it. We know that wisdom begins with the fear of the Lord. That's why, to some extent, if you're well brought up in a family that puts the Bible first, that makes sure that the dining room table does not allow phones, that devotions are interesting, then these things can be dealt with. We do better. On average, people who are in church 3 Sundays out of 4 cost the nation in lifetime health care cost 25% of the average value. We are incredibly more healthy than the people who are living the lives that are portrayed as good and right in the university today. So I'm not going to talk about wisdom, but knowledge comes next. Remember T.S. Eliot, where is the life we've lost in living? Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we've lost in information? We're down to information now. We don't even have knowledge. Now, there are several versions of knowledge, of course. It comes dressed in many different garbs. And hopefully you meet them here to some degree. An introduction to the great thinkers. So philosophers began by asking the question, what is a good life? And they've done this ever since. A few do it with the necessary humility, most do not. I saw a discussion between Tom Holland, who's recently come to faith through writing history, with Grayling, who's a rather silly atheistic professor, but it was a lovely YouTube to watch. He had nowhere to go. He was full of himself. Reductive scientists do it by studying the works of God, although they don't look upon them as the works of God anymore in the material world, and deriving laws. The ancient world didn't bother, the Middle Ages didn't bother with studying material because Plato looked down on it as not really worth anything. The ultimate, the metaphysical, the abstract was what mattered. But Christians primarily started the scientific revolution beginning in 1277 because they realized that they were not making progress by trying deductive logic over big questions. It wasn't producing practical results. And so they said, well, God made things, so we should be able to learn something by looking at his works. That's why they did it. The reason I can't make science work in Central Africa is because they still think paganly. Everything is explained in terms of evil spirits. You can't do an experiment because it's unthinkable unless you believe there's order beneath the surface chaos of life. That started it all off. And it turned out to be very successful in material terms. Too successful, because nowadays the politicians, when they want to say something that they don't want anyone to question, they say the science is in. Anyone who says the science is in doesn't know what science is. It's always changing. But that's the world we live in. It's been flattened out. Now, if you want to think about this a bit more, the best guy I've come across in the last little while is Ian McGilchrist. You can find him on YouTube to begin with. He's written a couple of very thick books, but he was a very smart guy who went to Oxford in the 70s and discovered that he wanted to do English, but they were only dealing with modern psychological novels that you read and throw in the trash, and they weren't dealing with anything that had eternal or long meaning and purpose. So he gave it up, became a physician, did research, and ultimately, after spending some time at Johns Hopkins doing brain imagery, he ends up as a psychiatrist. And of course, the anxiety is what he's had to deal with. But what came out of his work I found extremely helpful and interesting, and I should have noticed it. We should have noticed it in medicine a long while ago. Right and left brain, the standard fairy tale should be ditched. It's got nothing to do with it. But theology and philosophy need your right brain. to be done well. And if you don't exercise it, like muscles that are not exercised, it doesn't work very well. We've become incredibly left-brained, always checking boxes. That's left-brain stuff. So go and listen to him, and he will make you think about. But these scientific egos are also not without pride. All academics are. I usually call them prissy prima donnas, but they are. If you really want to get into trouble, you try and tell them they're wrong. They never change their mind. You have to wait for them to die to change what they've done. The COVID management is a classic example of this. 3 superb epidemiologists were cancelled because they said what you're doing is wrong. Only Sweden followed their rules. They'd been proved right. They were cancelled. One of them lost, I think it's 20 pounds in weight. He was so harassed at Stanford. That's our world. Now, are they going to say to them that you got it right? No, they're not even admitting it, except by lowering the demands they make of us. But you still see lots of people wearing masks, for instance. You only have to ask them, do your spectacles steam up when you're wearing a mask? Answer, yes, therefore the mask is not stopping the micro dots coming out, so to speak, with the bugs in. They get to your glasses, they get to the air. There's no evidence that they work for that purpose. They do in some cases, but not there. So we've become scientistic as people who believe in science without knowing any. The moment you start doing science, it changes, because you learn a lot along the way about how stupid you were most of the time. And if you're fortunate, you manage to get some of these things right. Now, I grew up in a blue-collar environment where nobody had gone to university, so nobody was contaminated by those things. And it was a safe place to be, because British education in the first half of the 20th century, when Frank went to school and Sally went to school in England, the Bible was read every day in school. It was taken out of school in North America in the 1960s. Utterly stupid thing to do. So it meant that working class people, probably the only thing they knew reasonably well as a book was the Bible. They didn't know it because they'd been forced to read it, but simply they heard it read when their minds were in a retentive state. So the 10 Commandments were accepted as norms. Thievery was not acceptable. Abuse of women was not acceptable. So I grew up in the British equivalent of Detroit, but we didn't lock our doors. There were no attacks on women. Divorce was a rarity, but nobody went to church. I think 2 families in our street of 400 houses went to church. It was school that did it, because the basic text had been transferred. Now, the only culture that's done this really well is the Jewish one. And that's why they hate it, of course, because doing it well, a la Deuteronomy 6, teaching the stories, the history of the nation to your children before the age of 7, gives you a very realistic view of the world. He did evil in the sight of the Lord. I think it's roughly 9 bad ones to every good one. So the Jews are realistic about what you're doing in business. They're also realistic about truth. So they win half of the hard Nobel Prizes every year, or nearly half. Tiny Israel. And that's what the rest of the world hates. They're always envious of success instead of trying to emulate it. Now, what we've tried over the years here is to help people to get in along that route. And we have succeeded beyond our wildest dreams in many respects. I was counting up the number of professors we've produced, and it's half a dozen out of 300. There's not many sort of first-year university classes that have got that number, and we get 1 doctor per year on average. So in 25 years, we've got 25 doctors out there. Lots of PhDs. Most importantly, lots of marriages that are fertile. That's the best of all. Because if we produce children and then educate them appropriately, then we will have lots of reason for hope. But if we do not get back to the dominant Judeo-Christian story, we're finished. And we're very close. There's been many studies of why cultures rise and why they fall. The best ones, about 80 of them, were studied by a guy at Oxford in the 30s, I think, and I only came across his work recently via Kirk Dunstan. But the amazing thing is that the capacity to be inventive, to drive your society on, is very much related to having stable families. And stable families depend upon, at their best, one man and one woman for life. That means sex doesn't dominate your life, especially when there was no means of controlling how many children you had, except not having too much sex. But, as Michelangelo said, you can't spend tomorrow morning what you spent last night. It leads to disciplined lives. So I teach my class every year. I ask them at the beginning, what do these people have in common? Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, Newton, Boyle, Faraday, Clerk Maxwell, Eddington, just to take one line of science thought, roughly. And none of them know. Every one of those is Christian. 4 of them are evangelical. And you don't know who they are. We are not even giving our children the heroes they should have. If we did that, it can spark things. The way Boyle got converted and turned into the man he was depended upon God intervening, and then he spent the rest of his life trying to make it happen. One of the books that Edward Tingley introduced me to was Anthony Esselun's book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Western Civilization. If you don't have it on your shelf, do get it. It's amusing to read. But I want to close with his comment on role models. And one of them that he chooses, he talks about Pascal, of course, is a wonderful one, and a few others. But he ends with Dr. Johnson. And I want to read to you what he wrote about Dr. Johnson. He was born in a town about 15 miles from where I grew up. Samuel Johnson was never rich, but he held his head among princes. Others may theorize about equality and liberty. That sounds modern enough. Johnson retained the services of Francis Barber, a black man from Jamaica, as his valet. He gave him a place to stay, paid him what he could, and educated him. When he died, Johnson bequeathed to Francis and his family a handsome sum. Johnson was a soft touch for people suffering. He kept at great inconvenience to himself an old woman in his apartment, Mrs. Williams. He was careful for her welfare, though she was not always grateful for it. He married a woman much older than he was, yet he was devoted to her in a simple and manly fashion. He tolerated Roman Catholicism when the fashionable attitude towards it was to scoff at it as superstitious. He trusted the sense of the common person, yet no one in Europe could match his breadth of reading and acuity of thought. As a child, he was annoying his mother one day, and she said, on Sunday, and she said, "Go upstairs and learn the collect for the day." He was an Anglican. Halfway up the stairs, he said, "Done that," and he had, and he didn't forget it. That was his mind. So he was the most enlightened man of the Enlightenment, but nobody except a few Englishmen knew it. We will not see his like again. Our schools, our legislatures, and our entertainment will see to that. Meanwhile, the church had better get involved in education to demand some changes. And Haidt proposes ways to go about this, but you want your children to go to schools where there is no iPhone operative within the school building except for adults. It's got to be taken out completely. Anything less, they'll play games with you, hiding them in books and goodness knows what else. That's got to happen. We have reduced play, particularly in Christian schools, to about half an hour a day. He points out that even criminals in high security containment are guaranteed 2 hours a day in the open air. When asked what they would do if it was cut back, they said there'd be more violence. Studies have been done, and when you change the curriculum to have less factoid, more play, unsupervised, except somebody watching from a distance to see that nobody gets killed, the school improves. The grades improve. We need to be a lot more relaxed with our children. God gave them minds that take in everything for the first 7 years, so fill them particularly with Bible stories, which is what we hope happens here, that as well as everything else, they go back with a real understanding that it was Judeo-Christian thought with the help of the Greeks. They only lasted for 300 years as a civilization, so they weren't too successful. But between them, they made us. No other culture made a major contribution. There's our hope, but we're not living it. So my final quotation. This is by Michael Polanyi, whose son has a Nobel Prize in chemistry, professor in Toronto. He himself was a Hungarian, and he was a chemist. And in his 20s, he was writing to Einstein, who replied. That's how good he was. And then in 1917, what happened? The Communist Revolution. And he realized that if it succeeded in Russia, it would swallow Hungary. And he had an opportunity to talk to the Minister of Science, and he asked what science was going to be like in the Eastern Bloc, and he was told the proletariat will tell the scientists what to do. Of course, the proletariat did no such thing, but the leaders of the Communist Party did, and it destroyed science. He knew that it couldn't work. He ended up in England running away from Marxism and Nazism. But he wrote this: "The adherents of a great tradition, which is what I hope everyone in this room is, are largely unaware of their own premises, which lie deeply embedded in the unconscious foundations of practice. If the citizens are dedicated to certain transcendent obligations, and most particularly to such general ideals as truth, justice, charity, and these are embedded in the tradition of the community to which allegiance is maintained, a great many issues between citizens, and all to some extent, can be left and are necessarily left for individual consciences to decide. The moment, however, a community ceases to be dedicated through its members to transcendent ideals, it can continue to exist undisrupted only by submission to a single centre of unlimited secular power." We've seen that happen. And we still haven't learned the lesson in many ways. The adherence of a tradition. I hope we send people away from here able to do that. That is our hope for the future. Thank you.